routine flight turns into an unexpected spectacle when a young black woman refuses to part with a mysterious box clutched tightly in her hands. The passengers around her grow restless, their whispers turning into open mockery. But no one is prepared for what happens when she finally opens it. What could she possibly be hiding? Before we dive into this unforgettable story, let us know in the comments section below where you're watching from today. Aaliyah kept her head down, her fingers wrapped around the wooden box resting in her lap. It was no larger than a shoebox, its surface smooth except for intricate carvings that ran along its edges. The flight had only just taken off and already she could feel the eyes on her. She didn't need to look up to know that people were watching, whispering. She heard them. "Finally, she holding onto that thing like her life depends on it," a woman in the row behind her muttered. "She won't even put it under the seat," a man responded, his voice laced with amusement. "What, does she think it's a bomb?" The chuckles that followed made her grip tighten. She closed her eyes for a moment, steadying herself. It didn't matter what they thought. She knew what was inside. She knew what she had to do. "Ma'am," a flight attendant's voice pulled her back. "We need you to stow that box under the seat in front of you or in the overhead compartment." Aaliyah shook her head, her voice calm but firm. "I can't." The flight attendant hesitated. Aaliyah could see the indecision in her eyes. "It's just policy, ma'am, for safety reasons." "I understand," Aaliyah said, her fingers pressing into the wood. "But I can't let it go." A few seats over, a man scoffed loudly. "Oh, come on, it's a box. What's in there, the Holy Grail?" Laughter rippled through the cabin. Aaliyah ignored it. The flight attendant exhaled, crouching slightly so that her voice was lower, more private. "I don't want to make this a bigger issue than it has to be. Please, just let me store it for you until we land." Aaliyah met her eyes. "No." For a few seconds, there was only silence between them. The flight attendant nodded once, forcing a polite smile before walking away. But Aaliyah could hear her murmuring to her colleagues up ahead. The whispers continued. "Crazy. Making everyone uncomfortable. Probably one of those paranoid types." Aaliyah focused on her breathing, staring at the seat back in front of her. She wouldn't explain herself. She didn't owe them that. She was used to this. Being watched, being judged. Ever since she boarded the plane, she had felt it. The little glances, the side eyes, the way people unconsciously pulled their belongings closer when she walked past. It was always the same. Only now, they had a reason to talk. They had something to cling to. The murmurs grew louder. "Bet she's got something illegal in there. If she's not hiding something, why won't she just put it away?" People like that always act like the rules don't apply to them. Aaliyah clenched her jaw. People like that. She had heard it before, in stores, in classrooms, in offices where she was the only black woman in the room. They said it casually, like it didn't mean anything. But she knew what they meant. The flight attendant returned, this time with another crew member. "Ma'am, I really need you to comply with our request." Aaliyah lifted the box slightly, pressing it against her chest. "I told you. I can't." The second flight attendant, a middle-aged man with graying hair, crouched down beside her seat. His voice was softer. "We're just trying to make sure everyone is safe." She held his gaze. "So am I." That unsettled him. He blinked, glancing at the box as if he could see through it. The tension in the cabin thickened. "Listen," the first attendant spoke again, firmer this time. "If you don't comply, we might have to escalate this situation." Someone 2 rows up whistled low. "Oh, here we go." "Just kick her off the plane," a man's voice called out. "We don't need this drama." Aaliyah inhaled deeply. She could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she forced herself to stay calm. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we're expecting some turbulence ahead. Please remain seated and fasten your seatbelts." Aaliyah felt the shift in the cabin before it happened, a slight dip, the faintest tremble in the floor beneath her feet, then another. The flight attendants backed away, hurrying to their seats. Aaliyah pressed the box closer to her chest. She barely noticed the first sharp drop. Gasps filled the cabin. A tray clattered somewhere behind her. The overhead compartments rattled. Then, another drop. Steeper this time. A shriek rang out. The lights flickered. People clung to their armrests, eyes wide, breaths shallow. And then, silence. The plane steadied. The turbulence had passed, but the damage was done. The mood had shifted. Aaliyah could feel it in the air. The fear, the suspicion. Someone up front spoke first. "That's it. I don't care what's in that thing. She needs to open it." More voices joined in. What the hell is she hiding? She wouldn't let it go, even when we thought we were about to crash. The whispers were gone now. This wasn't quiet judgment anymore. This was pressure, demands. The flight attendant unbuckled herself, rising slowly. Her face was pale. "Miss, I think, for everyone's peace of mind, you should open the box." Aaliyah hesitated. The whole cabin seemed to hold its breath. Someone else shouted, "Open it!" The chant started. Aaliyah looked down at the box in her hands. Her fingers hovered over the latch. She took a deep breath, and then the latch clicked. The lid lifted, and the cabin fell deathly silent. For a moment the plane existed in a vacuum of silence. The tension that had built up since takeoff shattered the second Aaliyah lifted the lid. People who had spent the last hours sneering at her, mocking her, now sat frozen in their seats, breath held, eyes locked onto the mysterious box resting in her lap. Someone near the front of the plane let out an audible gulp. "What the hell is that?" a man murmured. Aaliyah didn't answer. She just stared down, her fingers tracing the edges of the contents inside, her heart hammering so loudly she thought it might echo through the cabin. A woman a few rows back gasped. "Is that—" A flight attendant rushed forward, her eyes wide with panic, clearly expecting the worst. "Ma'am? What—" But she stopped mid-sentence, mouth falling open. The passengers craned their necks, some standing in their seats, desperate to see. Aaliyah exhaled through her nose, pressing her fingers lightly against the soft fabric inside the box. The item wasn't dangerous, wasn't illegal, but to them, to all of them, it might as well have been a live grenade, ready to explode. Sitting carefully inside the wooden box was a folded American flag, its crisp stars and stripes tucked in the ceremonial triangle known to those who had received one before. Next to it, resting gently against the fabric, was a military dog tag. A tag with a name, a rank, Aaliyah's father's name. The weight of it all pressed against her chest, heavier than anything she had ever carried. A man in the row across from her exhaled sharply. "Wait, that's a flag?" "Not just any flag," another voice whispered. "That's a burial flag." Recognition dawned on some of them, slow and creeping. The flight attendant blinked rapidly, her face shifting from authority to something softer. "Oh," she breathed, stepping back slightly. I didn't know." Aaliyah finally looked up, scanning the faces around her, the sneering businessman, the couple who had exchanged amused glances, the older woman who had openly scowled. Now their expressions ranged from confusion to something that almost resembled guilt. "You wanted to know what was in the box?" Aaliyah's voice was calm, though every syllable felt like she was pushing through a tidal wave of emotion. "Now you know." She reached into the box and ran her fingers over the cold metal of the dog tag. "My father was Sergeant Leon Carter," she continued, her voice steady but thick with something deeper. "He served in the U.S. Army for 22 years, 3 tours overseas. He died last month." A hush fell over the passengers. The same people who had mocked her, who had assumed the worst, now looked like they wanted to sink into their seats and disappear. The businessman who had laughed the loudest cleared his throat. I I didn't realize. No, you didn't, Aaliyah said, cutting him off. None of you did. You saw a black woman with a box and immediately assumed the worst. Someone near the back coughed uncomfortably. Aaliyah saw the woman who had accused her of being paranoid shift awkwardly in her seat, looking anywhere but at her. She wasn't done. This box, Aaliyah continued, lifting it slightly, is all I have left of him. Her voice wavered for the first time, but she kept going. This flag was handed to me at his funeral. This dog tag was worn around his neck until the day he took his last breath. And you, she looked around, eyes locking onto the most guilty-looking passengers. You turned my grief into entertainment, into suspicion. Nobody spoke. Aaliyah's hands tightened around the box, but her voice remained steady. You joked, you whispered, you assumed. Her eyes flicked to the woman who had suggested she was carrying something illegal. Tell me, what exactly did you think was inside? Drugs? A weapon? The woman flinched, her face reddening. I didn't. Yes, you did, Aaliyah interrupted, her tone firm. Because that's always the assumption, isn't it? A man near the back shifted uncomfortably. Look, I don't think anyone meant any harm. We just didn't know. Aaliyah let out a humorless laugh. Didn't know, she repeated, shaking her head. You didn't need to know. You didn't need to understand what was inside to treat me with basic respect. But you couldn't even do that. The flight attendant looked as though she wanted to disappear. Miss Carter, I sincerely apologize. Aaliyah looked up at her, searching her face. There was genuine regret there. It's not just you, she said. It's all of them. She let her words sink in. For the first time, no one had anything to say. The turbulence had settled. The plane was quiet, but the tension still lingered. Aaliyah took a slow breath, running her fingers along the soft folds of the flag before closing the lid carefully, securing the box in her lap once more. I told you I couldn't let it go, she said, quieter now. And I meant it. She adjusted in her seat, looking forward, done with the conversation. One by one, the passengers turned away. The whispers had died. The amusement had faded. Now all that was left was the weight of what had been said. Aaliyah leaned her head back against the seat, closing her eyes. She wasn't sure if she felt better, but at least, for once, they were silent. Aaliyah sat still, her fingers draped over the lid of the box as if guarding it from the world. The weight of the moment pressed into her chest, but she didn't let herself crumble. Not here, not now. Around her the cabin remained unnervingly quiet. The same voices that had mocked and prodded her just minutes ago had vanished. Even the flight attendants seemed unsure of their place in the moment, their polite smiles now replaced with something resembling shame. The businessman who had laughed the loudest was suddenly very interested in the in-flight magazine. The older woman who had called her paranoid stared out the window, as if the clouds outside could erase what had just happened. Aaliyah wasn't naive. She knew what this silence meant. It wasn't reflection. It was discomfort. The kind of discomfort people felt when forced to confront something ugly within themselves. She had seen it before. In classrooms where teachers hesitated before calling her name, making sure they pronounced it right so they wouldn't sound ignorant. In stores where cashiers watched her hands a little too closely, waiting for a reason to assume the worst. In job interviews where she was so articulate, as if it was meant to be a compliment. This was just another moment in a lifetime of them. A shift in the seat beside her made her glance to the left. A young girl, no older than 10, sat wide-eyed, her seatbelt pulled tight across her chest. She had curly blonde hair that fell past her shoulders and clutched a stuffed bear in her lap. Unlike the adults, she wasn't avoiding Aaliyah's gaze. Her mother, however, had turned stiffly in her seat, her hands folded tightly over her purse. Aaliyah sighed through her nose and looked away. She had said what she needed to say. A few rows ahead, the flight attendant who had initially confronted her cleared her throat. "Miss Carter," she said softly, inching closer. "Again, I truly apologize for the misunderstanding. Aaliyah cut her off with a look. "It wasn't a misunderstanding," the flight attendant faltered. "You assumed," Aaliyah said, her voice calm but firm. "All of you did. And the moment I didn't fit into the version of me you expected, you panicked." The flight attendant swallowed hard and nodded slightly. "You're right," she admitted. Aaliyah wasn't expecting that. "And I'm sorry," the woman added. "Truly. She hesitated, glancing back at the other attendants who stood nearby, watching the exchange. "We should have handled this differently." Aaliyah studied her, searching for insincerity. She didn't see any, just an uncomfortable truth the woman wasn't used to swallowing. She nodded once. "Yeah, you should have." The flight attendant pressed her lips together before stepping back, returning to her position near the galley. The cabin was still too quiet, the kind of quiet that stretched out like an awkward pause, waiting for someone, anyone, to fill it. Then a voice. Small. Curious. "Is that your dad's?" Aaliyah turned. It was the girl. Her mother stiffened, her grip tightening on her purse. "Hannah? Don't—" "It's okay," Aaliyah interrupted, her voice softening. The mother hesitated but nodded, letting her daughter continue. The little girl pointed at the wooden box. "Is that your dad's?" she asked again. Aaliyah looked down at it, fingers brushing over the smooth surface. "Yeah," she murmured. "It is." The girl's lips pressed together. "My uncle was in the army," she said. "He has one of those flags too. It's in a frame in my grandma's house." Aaliyah's throat tightened. "I think he'd be really happy you brought it with you," the girl added, her voice sincere. Something in Aaliyah's chest twisted. It wasn't sadness. It wasn't anger. It was something she hadn't expected to feel up here in the sky, surrounded by strangers. She offered the girl a small, tired smile. "Thank you," she said quietly. The girl smiled back. The moment was small, but it was something, a bridge in the middle of an ocean of judgment. Then, movement. Across the aisle, the businessman, the same one who had been smirking earlier, shifted uncomfortably. His hands gripped his seatbelt before he finally let out a breath and turned toward Aaliyah. "Listen," he started, his voice gruff. I just wanted to say I'm sorry." Aaliyah raised an eyebrow. He scratched the back of his neck. I shouldn't have jumped to conclusions. That was wrong." She didn't respond right away. She let him sit in the discomfort of it. And then, finally, she nodded. "Yeah, it was." He exhaled sharply, nodding in return before turning back in his seat. One by one, the energy in the cabin began to shift. The couple who had laughed along with him earlier looked down, their hands intertwined as if grounding themselves. The older woman who had whispered nasty things under her breath glanced at Aaliyah, then quickly looked away. She wouldn't get an apology from all of them. She knew that. Some people would carry their shame in silence. Others would convince themselves it was never that big of a deal to begin with. But for the first time since she boarded, the tension in the air wasn't directed at her. It was sitting with them now, lingering in the spaces between their seats, in the heaviness of their thoughts. Aaliyah looked down at the box again, her fingers gliding over the wood. Her father had carried so much weight in his life. The weight of his service, the weight of his sacrifice. And now this box was all she had left. She wasn't looking for justice on this flight. She wasn't looking for validation or sympathy. She just wanted people to understand. And maybe, just maybe, they finally did. As the plane cruised smoothly above the clouds, the seatbelt sign flickered off, and the pilot's voice came over the intercom with the usual announcements. But for Aaliyah, it didn't matter. Because for the first time in hours, she felt just a little lighter. The quiet remained, stretching across the cabin like an unspoken truce. No more whispers, no more sideways glances. Just the hum of the engines and the occasional rustle of movement as passengers adjusted in their seats. Aaliyah rested her hands on the box, tracing the grain of the wood, feeling the carved ridges beneath her fingertips. She let herself breathe. In, out. The weight in her chest was still there, but it was different now, lighter maybe, or just settled. A few rows up, the businessman coughed, his fingers drumming against his armrest. He wasn't looking at her anymore, but every so often his shoulders shifted like he was carrying something unfamiliar. Guilt, maybe. Awareness. The older woman who had scowled at her before takeoff now sat with her hands folded tightly in her lap, her gaze fixed straight ahead. She hadn't spoken since Aaliyah had opened the box, hadn't so much as breathed in her direction. Aaliyah didn't need her to. The flight attendant who had pushed her to comply walked down the aisle, glancing at her cautiously. Their eyes met, and for the first time, Aaliyah saw something different there. Not authority, not frustration, just understanding. The attendant hesitated before offering a small nod. Aaliyah returned it, and the woman continued on, disappearing behind the curtain toward the first-class cabin. The fasten seatbelt sign flickered on. "Ladies and gentlemen," the pilot's voice crackled over the speakers, "we'll be making our initial descent into New York shortly. Please return to your seats and fasten your seatbelts. Flight attendants, please prepare for landing." A ripple of movement passed through the passengers as they adjusted, clicking their seatbelts into place, securing their trays, stretching their legs one last time before touchdown. Aaliyah did the same, but her movements were slower, more deliberate. She ran her fingers over the flag inside the box once more before closing the lid. The girl beside her, Hannah, watched closely. "Does it hurt?" Hannah asked. Aaliyah blinked. "What?" "People say mean things," Hannah clarified, her voice softer now. "Does it hurt?" Aaliyah glanced around, but the girl's mother had fallen silent, her lips pressed together as she listened without interfering. Aaliyah considered the question. "Yes," she answered honestly. "It does." Hannah nodded like she understood, even though she was still too young to really grasp it. "I think people say mean things when they don't understand," she said. "Like when kids at school made fun of me 'cause I have two moms. They didn't know what they were talking about." Aaliyah tilted her head, impressed by the girl's awareness. "And what did you do?" "I told them my family is my family," Hannah said matter-of-factly. "And that if they had a problem with that, they could eat glue." Aaliyah chuckled despite herself. "That's a good answer." The girl beamed. "I think your dad was really brave." A lump formed in Aaliyah's throat, but she managed to keep her expression steady. "He was." Hannah nodded, satisfied, and turned her attention back to her stuffed bear, squeezing it tight as the plane dipped lower through the sky. Outside the window, the skyline of New York came into view. The city stretched out in all directions, its lights blinking against the dull gray of the approaching evening. The landing gear extended with a soft mechanical hum, and the cabin vibrated as the plane aligned with the runway. Aaliyah closed her eyes as the wheels touched down, the force pressing her back against the seat before easing as the plane slowed. The familiar sensation of landing always felt like a release. One more step forward, one more journey complete. As the plane taxied to the gate, the passengers began to stir again, this time in anticipation rather than judgment. Phones lit up, notifications buzzing. Seatbelts clicked open before they were even given permission. The businessman let out a breath and rubbed his temples. The older woman checked her watch, then smoothed her skirt. The flight attendants made their way through the aisle with forced, tired smiles. "Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to New York," the voice over the intercom announced. "Please remain seated until we arrive at the gate and the captain turns off the fasten seatbelt sign. We appreciate you flying with us." People barely listened. Overhead bins popped open, luggage pulled down. The energy was different now, everyone eager to move forward, to forget the awkwardness of what had happened. Aaliyah stayed in her seat. She wasn't in a rush. Hannah's mother reached for her carry-on but hesitated before glancing at Aaliyah. "For what it's worth, I hope you have a safe trip." Aaliyah studied her. She wasn't sure if the woman had felt the same way as the others, or if she had just been too afraid to speak up. Either way, the words weren't meaningless. "Thank you," Aaliyah said, nodding. Hannah grinned. "Bye, Aaliyah." Aaliyah smiled. "Bye, Hannah." The girl and her mother shuffled into the aisle and disappeared with the rest of the departing passengers. Row by row, the plane emptied, until Aaliyah was one of the last people left. She finally exhaled, picking up her box carefully before standing. The flight attendant who had challenged her earlier was waiting by the exit. She opened her mouth like she wanted to say something, but Aaliyah had already moved past her. Some things didn't need to be said. As she stepped through the jet bridge and into the terminal, the world bustled around her. Travelers hurried past, dragging luggage, making calls, meeting loved ones. The energy of the airport swallowed the weight of what had happened on that plane. And that was the thing, wasn't it? For them, it was just a flight, just another moment that would fade with time. For Aaliyah, it was something she would carry, but not as a burden. She shifted the box under her arm, straightened her back, and walked forward, because this was just one flight, and she still had a long journey ahead.